What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the longest film I've seen in quite some time, and that film is called The Brutalist. Directed by Brady Corbet, this film was also written by him alongside Mona Fastfold and stars people like Adrien Brody, Felicity Jones, Pearce, and many more. Whew, what a movie. You can always trust that A24 is going to give you a unique film, whether it be something that's bonkers and off the wall, some art house piece, some crazy psychological horror film, or in the case of The Brutalist, a really long dramatic picture that has a lot of stuff to talk about. As for filming this, I watched the film last night and I came home and I needed to sleep on it. I felt like I needed to just kind of take some time to ponder my thoughts, get some rest, wake up the next morning, see how I feel about the film, because this is a film that has a lot of really good reviews so far. It will be premiering in theaters for a limited theatrical run in December, and I had the opportunity to check it out quite a bit early. Now, this has started to have earlier premieres at certain festivals and in some other markets, so I have seen some people's reviews on this already, and the reviews for the most part are incredibly positive. There are some negative reviews in there, and I'm sure that this is going to be one of those films that may work for big cinephiles, but maybe not so much for a casual moviegoer, but is undeniably one of the most ambitious films I've seen in a long time, and maybe the most ambitious film I've seen in 2024. Without a doubt, the longest film I've seen in 2024, as this film clocks in at 3 hours and 35 minutes with a 15-minute intermission at the center of the film. I got to see the film yesterday, and yeah, man, this is the one that I really enjoyed for the most part. I have a lot to say about it, but before we get into my personal opinion on it, let's get into what this movie is all about. The Brutalist focuses on Adrien Brody as Laszlo Toth, a man who's escaping Europe after the war in 1947. This film takes place over the course of 1947 to 1980 as we jump around. The film is broken up into part 1 and part 2 with the intermission in the center and an epilogue at the very end of the film. Outside of him, we also have people like Felicity Jones, who plays Elizabeth Toth, the wife to Laszlo Toth, who unfortunately has to stay behind in Europe for a percentage of the film because they were separated due to the events of the war, the Holocaust, and all of those things. Alongside her is also their niece, who is the character of Sophia, played by Rafi Cassidy. Eventually, they're able to come to America and reunite with Laszlo and try to start building a new life for themselves. And over the course of the film, Laszlo would start to meet new people who would give him opportunities in the world, most notably a wealthy man played by Pearce, known as Harrison Lee, who gives him the opportunity to build a really big building. Because what this film is really all about is that Laszlo is a really acclaimed architect back in Europe, and Harrison falls in love with the work that he did back in Europe and wants him to build a big community center for him. That's where the title of this film comes into play, The Brutalist, because brutalism as a whole is a specific style of architecture that kind of rose up in the mid 20th century. And so the majority of this film really is just about this architect who's coming from Europe to escape the war. He's coming to America to try to make a new life for himself. And of course, there is that struggle of the trauma of the past, the things that they've been through back in Europe during the war, and having to come here now to America to kind of build that American dream lifestyle. And him kind of finding that path over the course of time and having to build up this, this ginormous community center for this very big wealthy man. Now, you may be questioning to yourself, how is a movie about an architect building a ginormous building for an American man? How is that a 3.5 hour movie? And what I'll start this off by saying is that there's a lot of layers to this film. That is just the premise of the film, but ultimately, because it does tackle the time frame of right after the war, and it deals with Jews who are coming to America and making a life for themselves, the film undoubtedly does tackle things like prejudice when it comes down to Jews coming to America. There is that part of the racism that's still kind of in the air, this judgment that's still in the air, the looking down upon them that's still in the air in the world at this time, despite the hardships that they had just faced. And while there are opportunities that start to open up for Laszlo over the course of the film, there are moments throughout the course of the film where he starts to learn that he still isn't necessarily viewed as equal, even if the hard work he's putting in is what they want from him. Outside of that, there's a lot of other things to tackle here as we see Laszlo be a character who is tormented in a lot of ways. He's struggling with substance abuse. He is not necessarily in the best place in his life. When he gets to reunite with his wife, there's a bit of a struggle there as they kind of reacclimate to one another and the new life, especially post-war. There's trauma within their lives. And I don't want to say too much to spoil anything, because I do think this is a film that cinephiles and fans of film in general should go watch. I think this is a film that you should try to go into as blind as possible, and so I don't want to give too much dialogue here as far as what's actually happening in the film, because this is one of those movies that is really about experiencing it and seeing how it plays out. This is a film that in a lot of ways, I don't necessarily know it needed to be as long as it is, but is a film that I think does a good job to kind of warrant that length. I would say that I think they could have knocked this film out genuinely in a solid 3 hours, but I am of the opinion that a movie is as long as it needs to be, as long as that time is used. There are films that I've seen that are an hour and a half long that ultimately sometimes feel overly long because it doesn't feel like they do an abundance with it. Sometimes there are films that are like 2.5 hours or 2 hours that you feel like they can kind of trim some fat. Similarly, I do think there are a couple of things that could have been trimmed off, some fat in the film that I don't necessarily feel like they really kind of built upon the way I wanted. There are a couple of characters throughout the course of the film that are integral and have key moments in the film, but that I never really felt I was fully invested in or fully kind of really developed in the way that I wanted to see. And so it was one of those things where like there were a couple of things that I felt maybe didn't need to be in the film that did kind of blow out the length. But what I can say is that I think that this film actually utilizes its 3.5 hour runtime incredibly well. And when I look at it in the two parts that this film was created in, the first part I think was really interesting. It kept me captivated. It kept me really engaged. And that's one thing I gotta praise this film for, is the pacing. For a 3.5 hour film, I ultimately didn't feel the length of this film. And when I think about films that I've seen in the past few years that have been very long, something like an Oppenheimer or something like Killers of the Flower Moon, those are two films that I can genuinely say I felt the length of, specifically something like Killers of the Flower Moon. And so in the case of The Brutalist, I really gotta, praise Brady Corbet for really being able to direct a film here that feels like it moves. It feels like it has things to say. It feels like it continually moves. It doesn't really drag the pacing out. It doesn't feel like nothing is ever happening. And it has some really great dialogue as well. There are great exchanges between characters that are really well done, and a lot of that is really heightened by the incredible cinematography. This has to be probably one of the best shot films I've seen this year. There's some really interesting and engaging camera work over the course of this film. There's some stuff that's really unique and artistic when it comes down to the camera work of this film, the editing, the way that the film feels as well, the overall musical score, the sound design. When it comes down to the technical aspects of this film, it is practically flawless. This has to be one of the best films I've ever seen in terms of the technical aspects. And it's a period piece that's jumping between a couple of decades, so you have to have the right cars, you have to have the right outfits, the right hair designs, all those kind of things. And I think for the most part, this film does everything to really make you feel like you are in that time. You also have things like different languages that are being spoken throughout the course of the film, different accents that are happening throughout the course of the film, and all those things are all kind of brought together to really take you back to a time period that doesn't exist anymore. And I think when it comes down to period piece films, you have to have all of those things work in kind of a synchronicity in order for the film to really work and sell you on the fact that you were taking a trip to the past. And I think that when it comes down to The Brutalist, all of the technical aspects I thought were absolutely flawless. And I think Brady Corbet had a great vision for what he wanted this film to be, and the people he had as a part of this film really came together to build a really, really strong, incredibly well-made film. There's no denying that at all. Even if you didn't love this film for its story or how it ends up or where it goes, I think that you will undeniably be incredibly impressed by how well made this film is, especially if you see it in a theater. Outside of those technical aspects, the performances here are phenomenal, with Adrien Brody giving maybe one of the best performances in his career, which is a lot to say because he's an incredibly acclaimed actor who's been in tons of films and has consistently given incredible performances. But his performance here is incredible, and he has the entire weight of this movie on his shoulders when it comes down to really telling this story. He is the first actor we focus on from the beginning of the movie all the way to the end. And while you do have other people that are fantastic in this film, like Felicity Jones, who's great in this film, Alessandro Nivola, Raffi Cassidy, Guy Pearce, I really want to praise what Adrien Brody did here. I think his performance is phenomenal. It's layered, and I think what the cast as a whole did here was create something that felt wildly realistic. The performances feel so real, so tangible, and Adrien Brody at the center of it really helps to kind of just push everything forward. And there's tons of supporting cast members in this 3.5 hour movie that you get to know over the course of the film, and all of those actors I think equally came to the table to play. They were there to play. They knew what they were going to do. They knew the assignment, and they all did an incredible incredible job when it came down to performances. And outside of Adrien Brody, I think Guy Pearce gave my second favorite performance in the film, as he plays this wealthy man who, you know, takes Laszlo under his wing to build this big building for him. And ultimately, it's through his eyes that we start to see some of the prejudice in the world. We get to start to see the difference, the divide between these immigrants coming over in this dark time and the people who are already well established in America. So there's a lot to say about this film when it comes down to all of those various thematic elements. But again, I don't want to give anything away because I do really think this is a film that you need to experience for yourself. And it's one of those things that, again, the performances and the overall technical aspects really elevated this film to being one of the best made films I've seen all year and one of the best made films I've seen in general. With all that said, it really comes down to story, right? I think for most people, can you captivate me with the story? And what I could say is that I think part one of this film is really strong. It builds a lot of tension, it sets the stakes for everything that's going on, and it's ultimately, again, a story about an architect coming to America and getting opportunities to bring his architecture to America. And it doesn't necessarily seem like the premise that should be in this long film, but I think that the film does incredible things in that first half of the film to really expand upon what's going on, really set up who all these characters are, really set up the stakes, and get you really invested. I heard a lot of the other critics saying when we were in the intermission that, like, it's long, it's, you know, not what they expected the film was going to be, but that it was like oddly really interesting. It was incredibly captivating. And I have to agree. I found that the first half of the film breezed by. By the time the intermission started, I was like, oh my God, 2 hours have passed by already. Like, I didn't even really think about it, you know, because the film had done its job to really create something interesting here with all those technical aspects that really work together to make a movie that flows, and it makes a movie that it's exciting to watch and has, you know, some really interestingly well put together dialogue. Then part two kicks in, and for the most part, I think part two is really solid. But by the time we get to the end of the film, I think that's something that kind of held me back a little bit, is that I'm still fully trying to understand what this film is trying to say. On one hand, it feels like a film that's about being able to come from a dark place in a dark past and come to America, come somewhere else, and kind of create a new life for yourself. There is a story of triumph here. There's also a story of tragedy here, and then there's an element of this film that I still don't fully know how I feel about it, and it's hard to talk about without getting into spoilers. There's an element near the end of the film that I do feel like was just so abrupt that it left me a little bit with lack of words. It left me feeling a little bit unsure of how I fully feel about the entire picture, because it's a film I wildly appreciate. It's a film that I wildly admire. It's a film that I feel is definitely worth the time of cinephiles and movie fans in general. But it is a film that asks you to go on a long journey. It is a film that asks you to see a story play out and has some story beats in the last 40 minutes or so that I don't think everybody's gonna like. And there are elements about the way that certain elements and certain story beats wrapped up at the end of the film that I thought were great and I thought were incredibly well done. And then there are some elements of the story beats that and how they wrap up at the end of the film that I can genuinely say felt a little bit unsatisfying. And so the end of the film felt for me a little bit like a mixed bag in my personal perspective, but it was undeniably so well made and undeniably so well acted, and the things that really worked to the point where I can't help but still be more positive about this film, because the overall experience was really something incredible. I think as a film fan, as somebody who just comes on this channel to ramble about movies that I love and express my adoration for this art form, it's undeniable that there is so much artistry, so much talent on display when it comes down to this film. There was just a couple of things narratively that I wish they would have really honed in on. There was a couple of things thematically that I still am scratching my head on just a little bit. And I think it's a movie that I'm going to need to maybe see again at some point. It's a movie that I'm going to maybe need to kind of sit on, talk to others who have seen this movie, and kind of see what others have to say about it. And so as time goes on, I'm very curious to hear what the conversation is around The Brutalist. I'm really excited to see how people enjoy it or don't enjoy it. If you look on Letterboxd, if you look on Rotten Tomatoes, the scores for it are fairly high right now. I think on Letterboxd, majority of the reviews are 4, 4.5, and 5 stars. And I am currently teetering, I don't really rate things here on the channel because on Letterboxd I will sometimes fluctuate and change. I like to just kind of give my thoughts verbally and not necessarily put a score to it. But I definitely agree with those scores at the same time in a lot of ways, while also having a part of me that would maybe score it a little bit lower. So with all of that said, I think The Brutalist is an incredibly well-made film that is certainly worth the time of cinephiles, movie fans everywhere. I think if you are somebody who's not really a big fan of long, drama pictures, this is not going to be for you. If you're not looking for something like this, then just listen to what I said. This is not for you. But if you are a big cinephile, if you're a big fan of the long, drawn out, dramatic, stories that take place in the past that are more about dialogue and more about character than it is about excitement and entertainment, then I think you're really going to enjoy this film. But I do think it's important to know that there are some story beats that may rub you the wrong way, and there might be some story beats that you really enjoy and some others that you don't really enjoy, which is something that's going to leave some people divisive when it comes down to a film that's this long, that asks you for so much of your time. But yeah, I really do think this is a film that's worth your time. I think it's something that's at least worth being part of the conversation on. And so I look forward to hearing various opinions on this one. So that's going to be my thoughts on The Brutalist. Definitely leave some comments down below. Did you like this movie? Did you not like this movie? Are you planning to check it out? Have you already checked it out? Whatever the case may be, I look forward to hearing any and all thoughts down below. And I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.